The No Nonsense Roundtable. It's a weekly show broadcast on Rochester, New York's 50,000-watt iHeart radio station, News Radio Wham 1180. The host, Dom Geneva, interviews guests from all walks of life, all with amazing stories to tell. What you are about to hear is a recording of a previous broadcast without the breaks and commercials. Now, here's host, Dom Geneva.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of the No Nonsense Roundtable. And today I have an exceptionally interesting show. I have Deanne Quinn Miller, who wrote a book and is the prison guard's daughter. Her dad was killed in the Attica Riots. And Gary Craig, who helped her write the book. And it's the 50th anniversary this year of the uprising, right? Mm-hmm. And things have changed in people's perceptions, people's knowledge. There's been more that has come to light. And exceedingly, we need to look and revisit the world the way it was, the way the world is now. And with that, I will ask you, how did the two of you get together to write this book?
Well, so 21 years ago, in the year 2000, the inmates of Attica who'd been there during the uprising, they had sued in the mid-'70s, and that was settled in the year 1999 and 2000. And Judge Teleska, the late Judge Teleska, was charged with deciding how much of a $12 million settlement the inmates should receive individually. And that gave rise to Dee's group, the Forgotten Victims of Attica, which she'll talk about. And she and I met during that time because, sadly, what the prison employees and their families had gone through back in 1971 had been unknown for many, many years. And I began covering that. And we got to know each other, and years later, she was kind enough to share her story with me, and we put it together as a book.
So how did you get to Gary? How to ask him to co-write this with you?
Well, actually, Gary asked me to co-write it with him.
Ah,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, we had tried this idea about 10 years ago, and, we started writing, and I was just not ready then, and so we stopped. And then 10 years later, almost to like the week, if I'm not mistaken, he called and said, listen, I think if we're going to do this, we need to do it now.
So you reached out to her.
Yeah, Dee's story I've always found inspiring on so many different levels, and we'll talk about that. And I've said this before, I'm doing what may be called, whether it's a co-authored book and as told to book, however you want to call it, wasn't something I ever really wanted to do unless it was Dee's. And that's, again, because I think the strength and resilience that she's shown during the past 50 years is so remarkable. So I feel blessed to be able to help tell that story.
If I was to categorize this before we get into a little bit more of the detail, I wrote down 4 things. What I'd like to kind of scope this out with is, it seems like there's facts, feelings, observations, and conclusions to the whole story. Let me ask you first about the feelings. Tell me about your dad. Now, you were 5 when this whole thing happened, so you don't have a lot of memories of your dad, but tell me what you remember about him.
Well, that's the crux of kind of the book in general, right, is this journey of knowledge, because I was 5 years old. And my memory, combined with the trauma, I think, left me with just fragmented pieces. Mm-hmm. And I just didn't know that much about him. And oftentimes I didn't have a memory unless it was, someone would give me a picture or something, and then sometimes it would come back. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, the things that I remember about my dad is that he was just a handsome man, mm-hmm. A family man. I know he was a good husband, according to my mother. I thought he was a great dad, and I think he was a great man in our community. He was president of the fire department, mm-hmm. and I think community was very important to him and giving back.
So let's go back to those days, and I was only in college back then, and I didn't really realize what was going on. So give me a little idea of what precipitated the whole thing.
Well, in late July, there was a manifesto that was circulating amongst the inmates within the prison. And at that time, I believe it had 26 original demands on it. And they found corrections officers that they thought, would look at it and say, mm-hmm. is this like out of line? Is this like too much? And some correction officers, including Michael Smith, was one of the ones who looked over it and said, I don't really see any problem with this. Most of the demands were very humanitarian in nature, and they ranged from anything from having additional toilet paper, to additional showers, to being able to have correspondence with their family without their letters being opened, magazines that maybe were religious-based, and also make diets of Muslims and other people, that were of different religions or nationalities. And so that was circulating in the prison in early July, and it was seen by some corrections officers. Then, several days before the riot itself erupted, there was some horseplay in D Yard. And what ended up happening was a correction officer went over to kind of break it up, and one of the two actually shoved a correction officer. Mm-hmm. And in general, that had never happened before. So that was a pretty big deal. And then there was a meeting about that, and there was another incident that happened the day before the riot with a soup can being thrown at a correction officer in one of the galleys. Mm-hmm. And then it was that next day that my dad was working in Times Square, which is the hub of the prison, mm-hmm. where all of those hallways and tunnels come together. And the inmates went to chow. My father unlocks the door, lets those individuals come through with their corrections officers, comes back through, and while they're in a tunnel, they get to the door that goes out to the yard. So mm-hmm. every single day, they finish with chow, go through a tunnel, they open the door, they go out, they do rec in the morning. Mm-hmm. That door was locked. That door was locked because they intended to get the inmate that had thrown the can mm-hmm. out of the line and take him to another area of the prison.
Okay.
That's when the whole thing blew up.
So if I understand it correctly, was there a miscommunication that the whole group was being punished rather than looking for this one guy? Or how did that get so violent so quickly, do you think?
Well, I think they went in to get this individual earlier, but someone had lifted his gate, so he ended up going to chow. And so they just decided rather than, make a scene mm-hmm. on the way, they would get him on the way back.
In this, that was shortly before your dad was hurt incredibly. He was accosted, beat up, and thrown off a second balcony. Is that true?
No.
These are the things that you hear online, okay, mm-hmm. or you hear online, or you hear in news reports. Mm-hmm. And it's good that you're here to correct these things. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That is an untruth that has unfortunately been told in some circles for many years. I mean, you have to figure out where he was, and if you have any layout of the jail whatsoever, you would know that in order for them to throw him out a window, first of all, he's on the ground floor, okay. which is where the tunnels are, okay? And then there was the only way that they could have gotten him up anywhere, they would have had to open up, get his keys, open up the door that goes up to the hub of the Times Square, which is above ground then, which puts you on the catwalks. Uh-huh. Those windows have metal gates on the windows. Even if you threw my father out that window, he would just land about 2.5 feet down on the catwalk.
You must be frustrated with a lot of the stuff that's been published about this whole incident. And it's great that you wrote a book and you can set the record straight.
That's what I hope to do.
Okay. You're listening to the No Nonsense Roundtable. I'm Dom Genova, your host, here with, D. I can call you D, right?
You sure can.
D. Quinn Miller and Gary Craig, investigative reporter for the Democrat and Chronicle. And the book that they have collaborated on is The Prison Guard's Daughter, of which D is. And during the last segment, I brought up something that I read in the news, not one of these fake news reports. It was a legitimate news source that gave an account of how her dad passed away. And she had to correct me, which is perfectly okay. And it just leads me to the fact that there's been an awful lot of things that have been said and published in legitimate news sources that it seems like you have the knowledge to correct.
Yes, I do. I mean, there's plenty of things. I mean, that story that you just told, that's been going around for 50 years now. And for as long as I have been trying to tell people that is absolutely not the way my father died. And my father died when the gate from a tunnel came down, and he was beaten by inmates, and he was severely beaten and left in Times Square. He did not get carried up a set of stairs and thrown out a window. I know for a fact, I've spoke to inmates and correction officers both who have told me, especially the inmates that picked up my dad. I mean, there he was injured in Times Square. And I don't know for how long he laid there with his injury, mm-hmm. but at some point there were some inmates that came back through Times Square and realized that it was my father and that he was terribly beaten. And they went into A block and they got a mattress and they put him on the mattress and they carried him to the administration building.
Well, one thing you just mentioned that is awfully important is that you say that you've talked to the corrections officers and the inmates.
Absolutely.
And tell me about that.
Well, I think for a very long time, I don't think I probably would have considered maybe getting my information from the inmates, because in the world that I grew up, it was always like inmates bad, corrections officers good. But the fact of the matter is when you have correction officers that also tell you, listen, I was very beat up in the same area that your father was. I tried to help him, but I couldn't because I was so injured. I do know that there was some inmates that came by and took your dad up. So then I was on a quest, and with the help of an individual who was making a movie at the time, he connected me with the inmate, Richard Clark, who actually stopped and helped get my dad on the mattress and get him to safety.
So, Dee, from talking to you, I'm getting the impression that the narrative that has been told about the riot from the side of corrections, the government, politicians, is really something that has bothered you.
Absolutely. I mean, the lies are plentiful.
Explain to me, educate me. Tell me the things that people need to know that they don't know, or misconceptions that they have, or false statements, whatever you can do to clear up exactly what the record is and what happened.
I think one of the misconceptions is, during the time that our family members were held as hostages, both state employees and corrections officers, that they were held in a safe area where they were protected by inmates that were particularly chosen to protect them. There is a terrible rumor that has gone around that Frank Big Black Smith castrated one of our corrections officers, Michael Smith, which never happened. And unfortunately, that rumor was let out during the time that they were held. And I think that rumor being released really excited the police forces that were on the outside. And I think when they heard that, they just really, it just took it to a whole nother level. That, of course, is a rumor. I also want people to know, and because people still think this after 50 years, is that those 10 hostages that were killed were all killed by inmates. And they weren't killed by inmates. They were killed by police, gunfire, a personal sidearm, gunfire, and that two of our corrections officers did indeed have very terrible slit throats that required, many, many stitches. So we did have two correction officers that did have their throats slit, but they did not have injuries that, caused them to die of that. Those individuals are actually still living. So those are two probably of the biggest ones.
So what you're saying, if I understand it, is that your dad was the only fella that was killed by the inmates.
Correct.
That's amazing. I think most people don't know that.
You're probably right.
So if I were to frame this in my own mind from what you said, the administration's reaction to the uprising made it much worse than it needed to be.
Yes, I agree with that.
And cost people lives.
I agree with that.
And cost even their own people's lives.
I completely agree with that.
I don't know what to say. I just absolutely don't know what to say. The way that you found this out was over, how many years, Gary?
Well, Dee really started researching the riot, I think mostly as a teenager and in college. And then I think really with the group that she was a key part of, the Forgotten Victims of Attica, which came to life in 2000, which is, folks like Dee, the surviving families of prison employees and some prison employees themselves who survived the uprising. They really did a tremendous job, I think, of getting the truth out and the facts out about what really happened in 1971.
Yeah, and life in 1971. 1971, let's see, Richard Nixon was the president, and Nelson Rockefeller was the governor. And I would have to think that some of the decisions that were made were done for a specific political reason. And I'm going to ask you that question when we come back from the break. So we're back on the No Nonsense Roundtable. I'm here with Deanne Quinn Miller, the prison guard's daughter. Her dad was killed in the Attica riots. And Gary Craig, who co-wrote, is that the right word for it? Co-wrote the book?
Works for me.
Okay.
Yes.
And at the bottom of the hour, as everybody knows, I like to give a shout out to the Bob Johnson Auto Group, who allows me to do this and pays for the show and sponsor the show, and a good place to buy a car or get a car fixed. Now, Dee, there's a lot of emotion here, and the question that I have about the prison all told, you said that they had like 26 requests, the inmates did?
Correct.
And you seem to be very fair about this. You seem to have the opinion that a lot of them were legitimate. Now, that's probably true, right?
That's very true. Mm-hmm.
So, it overcrowded.
Terribly overcrowded. I think 45% overcrowded.
And racial tensions.
Absolutely. I mean, most of the inmates were black from New York City, and almost all of the guards, I think all of the guards, were white rural people. And
the administration not listening?
No, I think the administration did not listen. I know for a fact when they had a conversation with the superintendent at the time, and that was by one of the union heads, had a conversation with Mancusi, who said, we know what's going on in the jail and things are just getting worse day by day. I think what we should do is lock down the jail. And Mancusi said, basically, thank you very much for your opinion, but why don't you get back to your post?
So it was happening over time, a powder keg about to explode with just the right spark then. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Governor Rockefeller authorizes the state troopers to take this over by force. And they're well armed. Do the inmates know what was going on? Did they get a last call saying, hey, we're going to come in shooting unless you give up?
They gave them an ultimatum.
Did they?
On the 13th. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the inmates, the mistake that they made, of course, is that they thought that they were going to come in with rubber bullets. Mm-hmm. And then the inmates also said, let's take these, I think it was 8 or maybe more, hostages up on the catwalks, and we'll show them that they're alive and well, but we're also going to be threatening at the same time. Essentially, if you come in, these individuals will be killed. And each one of those individuals had at least one, if not 2, executioners on either side of them. And that was on the catwalk. And then the retaking began. And on the opposite catwalks were state troopers, which were 270 sharpshooters, which, if I could say, were very excellent in their duties. They absolutely took care of many of the inmates that were planning on killing our correction officers and state employees that were held up there. They dropped the CS gas, and I don't know if you've ever seen film of it, but in my opinion, there's no way you could ever see anything with the amount of gas and the thickness of the gas. And then the shooting started.
So the shooting was indiscriminate, pretty much.
Yes, it was ruled excessive force.
The way this came about is that the ultimatum wasn't accepted, but that wasn't the only thing that the administration could do, right? The governor was asked to come in.
The governor was asked to come in, yeah. And the governor said, I will not negotiate with these liars and thieves. And he didn't come.
And do you think that that made things worse?
I don't know. That's the one thing that I do think about a lot, whether it would have made any difference if the governor would have come.
Well, in some respect, you're talking about an administration back then, like I said, Nixon and Rockefeller, and the perception, in my mind, that they would be, quote unquote, tough on crime and not be intimidated and have perhaps a very hard stance which wouldn't let them listen to the other side. I mean, do you give any adherence to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's exactly what was going on. And I think with Governor Rockefeller's aspirations for the White House, I think that was his intention, that he was not going to go to Attica and negotiate.
And because he was looking to run on a law and order ticket.
Correct.
You can't go back in time and second guess the decisions, but it seems like that was certainly a direction. I see, Gary, you nodding your head up and down.
Yeah, and you also have to think of that era. There was civil rights, anti-war going on, and as you mentioned, President Nixon was really sort of trying. He was set up as the kind of those were his opposing forces in his mind, and that was playing out within the prison. I mean, those same forces were going on behind prison walls. People were sort of vigilant, getting more vigilant about their rights behind the prison walls than they had been in years past.
Mm-hmm. So Dee, tell me more, the most important thing of your book. What do you want everybody to come back with after reading your book? The impression, the thought, the one thing that people need to know?
I think that it's a cautionary tale. It's a memoir of a little girl who grew up in the aftermath of Attica. But it's also cautionary in that we still have how many prisons in New York State and around the country, and every day corrections officers and civilian employees go into those jails, and those doors get locked behind them, and they make the assumption that they're going to be coming home that night. When in fact, I believe at any time, any one of those jails is a powder keg, just as Attica was. And you could be that family who loses someone. And I would hate for people to go through what we did, what our 50 families did in the aftermath of Attica, in the abysmal treatment that the state of New York gave us.
So Dee, what I hear in your voice is empathy for people that are in the prison system, no matter where it is. You have empathy for them.
I do.
And you have a feeling, legitimate feeling, that the prison guards and the people working in the prison need empathy too.
It's a job. It's not as popular as being, a street cop or whatever it is. These are people who go behind walls every single day that we don't talk about. We don't talk about what happens inside those jails for the most part. But every day they go in and they do time just like those inmates, but they do it in maybe 8-hour segments or 12-hour segments or 16-hour segments, but they're marking time.
Oh my Lord, that's a revelation. They are in prison too. The prison guards are in prison too. It's not fun for them either. So, Dee, from talking to you, it sounds like the taking of the prison was not constructed to be a rescue operation to rescue the hostages.
I believe that it was not to rescue the hostages. I believe the plan was to retake the building.
By the powers that be, to send a message to other prisons and other correctional facilities that don't try this because we're not there to be messed with.
I think that is an accurate statement. I think that that's exactly the message that they intended to send out.
Whole wars are fought like that.
I've had people to this day tell me Attica was a success because we haven't seen an uprising like that since, which seems to discount that 43 people died.
Well, I'm Dom Genova, your host, here with Gary Craig and Deanne Quinn Miller, authors of The Prison Guard's Daughter, of which Dee is. And we're talking about Attica and the uprising and whatever. And I'm going to, we have like a 9-minute segment here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to let you loose. I mean, tell me the stuff that you've been through, the frustrating things that you've seen, experienced and whatever, and the journey over the last 50 years. I mean, just go at it. I can tell there's some passion there.
Gosh, I don't even know where to start, really. I mean, I there's a lot of things that make me very upset about Attica, obviously. I think one of the things that people don't know about is, the survivors were treated terribly. And when I mean treated terribly, one of the things that people don't understand is that the workman's compensation was never set up to compensate people for death. It was to compensate people for injury. Mm-hmm. So when our fathers ended up at the hospital, right, the widows, said, here's the insurance card. Oh, no, it's taken care of. Mm-hmm. The state paid their hospital bills. My mother goes to the funeral home to pick out a casket for my father. They say, pick out whatever you'd like, Nancy. Mm-hmm. The state's paying for the funeral. My mother says, isn't that great? Okay, so while my mother is home and my father is deceased, the state says, we're going to send you checks. They're going to be your husband's checks, same income, same check amount. Just cash that check and, take care of your kids, take care of yourself. My mother cashes the check. And every single one of those was an election of remedy. When we accepted those things, even unknowingly, the state of New York, essentially, we forfeited our remedy of election. So by doing those things and accepting those things, we lost our ability to sue the state of New York.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty disgusting. And it was intentional. And later on, we ended up finding an individual by the name of Morris Jacobs who actually gave us a deposition. He was a mid-level supervisor at the time within the Workmen's Compensation Insurance Fund who said they absolutely did this. And they did this because I think that if all these families were to sue the state of New York for the injuries and death of their loved ones, we would bankrupt the state of New York. Mm. So they very quickly and very, Intentionally, absolutely did these things. And it is actually the Workmen's Compensation Insurance actually broke their own rules because prior to this, you were supposed to not approach a widow until they had legal representation so that they could make their own choices. But the state never did that. So here's the other ass kicker. So while our fathers were in the yard, they were paid for 16 hours, 2 8-hour shifts, right? The other 8 hours they didn't get paid for because that would be sleep time.
Oh, my Lord.
While they were in the yard, they got these checks, food checks, and it would be for the amount of food that they would have typically eaten when they were held hostage. And that they came to like weird amounts, like $21.07 my Uncle Dean got a check for. And ultimately, Linda Jones got a check that she thought was very strange, and it was a food check. It was a check for her husband who was killed, and she was going to cash it. And a friend said, no, don't cash it. Why don't you take it to this attorney over here and just kind of run it by him? An attorney who ended up taking the case. And she later, because she didn't cash a check and she didn't use her election of remedy, she was able to sue the state of New York. And I believe it was the mid-1980s, the state of New York settled with her, and her payout was approximately $1 million.
That's unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And from what you're saying, there was no support or representation that was afforded you. There was nobody that was helping you navigate through any of this.
No, there was nobody. It was just several days after the riot where authorities from DOCS came in. I think it was Commissioner Oswald as well was there at the meeting at a church and basically said to all of the survivors, go ahead and take 6 months off. Just take 6 months off, pull yourself together, take care of yourself, take care of your family. We're going to continue to pay you. Guess what was in that paycheck? Workmen's compensation. They lost their right to sue.
Oh, my Lord.
Mm-hmm. And what their bonus was right, when they returned to the jail, for those that did return, they were promised a better job. So many of them ended up being in positions where they were not in population.
Now, there was a compensation program for the inmates, right?
Well, no. What happened with the inmates was the inmates sued in 1975-76 for both what happened with the retaking, and a number of them were brutalized and beaten, including one Dee mentioned earlier, Frank Smith, terribly tortured after the retaking. And they brought a lawsuit, and it went to court several times, multiple times. They won a round in federal court in Buffalo. It was successfully appealed by the state. And then finally the state said, I'm sure partly a financial decision, that this is going to cost us more to keep litigating this than if we just give some money. And so in 1999 and 2000, they decided to give the inmates $12 million, $4 million, which went to the lawyers, which sounds like a lot. But you have to remember that these lawyers had worked for 25 years without any compensation for the case. So that then ended up being divided among the inmates, that state settlement.
And in the meantime, they were ignoring your family.
Continuing to ignore us, the Forgotten Victims of Attica, which we formed in 2000. Yes.
And how did that whole thing come together, organizing that group? Who was the head of that?
It was interesting because it started off by a radio station first. We had a local radio station, WBTA, and there was two individuals that decided to do a radio station, and somebody called from Attica and said, if you really care about Attica and you really care about the story of Attica, why don't you come to Attica? So they set up a radio station remote in Attica, and I got a phone call from G.B. Smith, who said, hey, they're going to do this radio show. And he was held hostage, surviving hostage, and he called and said, why don't you come? And I said, well, I'd have to think about it. And this is, early on. I was just like living my life. I had kids. I was married, the whole thing. And I was like, I don't really know if I want this back in my life again, even though Attica is my life. And so I decided that I would go, and my mother went, my sister went. And it was absolutely eye-opening because for the first time in my life, I was looking around the room and I was hearing names like Cunningham and Montleone and Smith. And I had read those names in the book, but I didn't know who they are. And now here they are, and we were kind of introducing ourselves to each other. And we ended up getting together in the months that followed. And then we ended up getting together for like 4 years every Monday night while we were forming the Forgotten Victims of Attica. And we lobbied the state because you have to remember at this point, after we've done our election of remedy, we have no right to sue. So the only thing we can do is get out there and tell the truth and kind of shame the state, if you will, into doing something for us similar to what they did for the inmates.
Well, let me ask you a question. After all this time, 50 years, have you become close with the other prison guard families?
Yes, I would say that is one of the good things that has come out of this is that I have almost like a completely, separate family that are the Forgotten Victims of Attica. And these people are wonderful because, they have lived in the aftermath of Attica as I have, but in their own way. And our meetings were great places to sit and talk. And as Kent Montleone said during our anniversary, that getting together with the group was the best therapy he's ever had in his life.
I can see by the light in your eyes that's the truth.
It is.
Well, in between the break, we were talking, and you kept on saying, this is the tip of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg. But my impression is that that's the reason to buy the book, because the rest of this, there is more that can be covered in this 1 hour that we had afforded to us right now. And let's tell people how to get the book. It's on Amazon, I would imagine, right?
You can order it on Amazon.com, Barnes & Nobles.
Yes. There's independent bookstores around. Independent bookstore websites have it. So it's, if you just plug The Prison Guard's Daughter into Google, you'll find many, many ways to buy it.
Well, it's a compelling story for just a number of reasons, and I really appreciate you coming on my show for this, and it's an honor to have you here, and God bless you for everything that you've gone through and what you're trying to do here with this book, is educate people.
Thank you for having us.
So next week, 10 to 11 on News Radio WHAM 1180, and always on the NoNonsenseRoundtable.com, where you can find any of our previous shows. And if you'd like to suggest a guest, you can go on to NoNonsenseRoundtable.com and contact Dom. It's right there. So we'll see you next week at the same time, and have a good week.